Okie dokie. So hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. Hello, and thank you all for gathering here today. If you joined us last week, welcome back. And a very big thank you to the speakers who are joining all of us this afternoon. Bonjour, merci à tous d'être ici aujourd'hui et un grand merci aux orateurs qui se joignent à nous cet après-midi. My name is Nicholas Johnston, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. I'm joining you all today from my office here in Ottawa, Ontario, on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. Je m'appelle Nicolas Johnston. Je serai le modérateur de la discussion aujourd'hui. Je me joins à vous tous aujourd'hui depuis mon bureau d'Ottawa sur le territoire non cédé et non abandonné de la nation algonquine Anishinaabe, dont la présence ici remonte à de temps immémoriaux. If you joined us last week, you'd know that today's event is the second of 3 sessions exploring cabinet documents. Last week, we explored memorandums to cabinet. Today, we're going to talk about the budget process, which is very exciting, budget submissions. And then next week, we're going to explore the Treasury Board submission process. This event series is being brought to you by Interconnects, ISED's Young Professionals Network, and IPAC NCR, the National Capital Regions chapter of the Institute for Public Administration Canada. Quite a mouthful. Both Interconnects and IPAC NCR put on events like this throughout the year and are focused on engaging with public servants about the work that we do and to give an opportunity to connect with fellow colleagues. If you want to know more about or register to become a member of Interconnects, the IPAC, please follow the links in the chat to gain access to more events just like this one. L'événement d'aujourd'hui est le second de 3 sessions explorant les documents de cabinet. Cette série d'événements est organisée par Interconnects, le réseau de jeunes professionnels de ISDE et IAPC-RCN, la section de la région de la capitale nationale de l'Institut d'administration publique du Canada. Interconnects et IAPC organisent tous 2 événements comme celui-ci tout au long de l'année, dans le but de sensibiliser les fonctionnaires au travail qu'ils accomplissent et donner l'occasion d'entrer en contact avec d'autres collègues. Si vous souhaitez en savoir plus ou vous inscrire pour devenir membre d'Interconnects ou de IAPC, suivez le lien dans le chat et accédez à d'autres événements comme celui-ci. So today is a very rare opportunity to have an open discussion about the Q&A about the budget submission process. On our panel of speakers today, we have very special guests, Adam Schjott, a senior director with the Grants and Contributions Center of Expertise and Treasury Board Affairs team within ISED. Michael Assad, a senior director with significant experience drafting and managing submission of budget materials with the Innovation Policy and Integration team here within ISED. And Rachel Lawless, a director with the Cabinet Affairs team, also within ISED. Given their experience, I think it's fair to say that we have yet another excellent group of speakers here today to discuss cabinet documents with. The format for today's session will primarily be a discussion. We'll hear from the speakers about their experiences and thoughts that they have. And ideally, it's going to be fun for everybody here today. It's going to be a natural dialogue and a conversation, although we will start with a very brief presentation. Speaking of which, the first speaker we will hear from today is Michael Assad, who's going to shortly share his screen and run us through a couple of slides about what a budget submission is to set the frame for the discussion afterwards. And then I will open the floor to everyone in the audience to raise your hands and ask your questions on camera, or you can submit your questions into the chat. Then I will pose your questions to the panelists for you. Le premier orateur que nous entendons aujourd'hui est Michael Assad, qui partagera son écran et nous présentera quelques dispositifs sur qu'est-ce qu'une soumission budgétaire. Puis je donnerai la parole à tout le monde public pour qu'il lève votre main et poser votre question dans la caméra, ou qu'il soumette les questions dans le chat, après quoi je le poserai aux panélistes. Okay, so with the housekeeping out of the way, Michael, I will pass things off to you and you can present for us.
Great. Merci beaucoup, Nick. Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you and see your screen.
All right. Alors, merci de m'avoir demandé de présenter. Je vais faire la majorité de la présentation en anglais. J'ai tenté de traduire simultanément et n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en français, bien évidemment, puis je peux répondre en français. C'est juste mes notes sont toutes écrites en anglais. Alors, I'll just quickly go through the presentation. So first and foremost, what is a budget proposal? And it's really, detailed information about proposed funding for either new or existing initiatives to support decision-making in the federal government's allocation of financial resources. So essentially, budget proposals are how line departments, well, any department and minister ask for the authority to spend money on programs. So to put it in context, ministers determine which budget proposals to bring forward based on a variety of considerations. Either you have policy direction from the electoral platform, you have obviously the speech from the throne, which will give you a lot of the priorities for a government's mandate. You have the mandate letters, which are now public, and of course, direction from the Prime Minister. As well, proposals are often driven by operational considerations, such as imminent, sunsetting programs of successful programs, or the need to expand capacity on existing initiatives. Les propositions du budget ou les présentations du budget sont souvent, mais pas toujours, précédées par des autorités de politique. Alors, les ministres cherchent les autorités à travers d'un mémoire au cabinet pour confirmer en principe pour avoir l'approbation en principe avant de soumettre une proposition au budget. So I'll repeat that one in English just I know I said it's fairly Anglophone these days, but budget proposals are often, but not always, preceded by policy authorities. Ministers seek the policy authority through an MC to confirm agreement in principle prior to bringing forward a funding proposal. I will say each government does take a very different approach to this. It can sometimes precede the budget, it can sometimes follow the budget, and sometimes your budget can actually confer your policy authority without having the need to go through the MC process altogether. So, you're often adapting to the government of the day, the style of the ministers and the prime minister. So just a side note on that. And then funding allocated in the budget or the fall economic statement or an off cycle, which I'll quickly cover as well, requires implementation authorities to be accessed. So either, we've already spoken about the policy authorities, but you will have to go through a Treasury Board submission as well to draw down the funding. Oftentimes you'll be kind of working through the design of a program and working through all the details from your record of decision that generally follows the budget by a few days to a few weeks, which will give you the details that are not necessarily outlined in the budget document itself. And lucky for you, Adam, Rachel, and I have all spent time at Treasury Board, and I think joined ISED from Treasury Board. So we have both worked on the budget process from a TV perspective and also on the implementation of authorities. So I'll stay on this slide here. The typical budget cycle requests proposals from ministers in the fall. Obviously, most departments will start their planning cycle around the spring. And this is all for potential inclusion in the spring budget, so tabled the following spring. However, funding can also be announced in the fall economic statement, or as I mentioned earlier, an off cycle, so whenever funding is needed throughout the year. And quickly touching on an off cycle, essentially you're following the same process as you would through a normal budget process. So it's a letter from the minister to the Minister of Finance outlining the specific details of your proposal and giving the rationale and whatnot. And that'll follow the same process with central agencies as well, where it goes to the Minister of Finance for approval. Once that's done, then go to the Prime Minister for approval as well, and your decision is rendered. So line departments such as ISED support ministers in developing the formal proposals, which are often referred to as two-pagers, but in practice are much closer to 10 to 20 pages or more. And these proposals are summarized in a formal letter from each minister to the Minister of Finance. So of course, ISED has the pleasure of serving 5 ministers now, which means 5 letters. and the ministers share a package of proposals supporting annexes and a summary letter with Minister of Finance. And then finance goes through its process. So they'll provide a challenge function. They'll conduct analysis of proposals to support the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister in final decision-making. Of note, oftentimes they have their own triaging process, and it could happen that your proposal doesn't even make it to the eyes of the Minister of Finance, and much less so the eyes of the Prime Minister. So if you, I mean, that's just a note. So oftentimes near the end, you can kind of tell what's actually been sent to the Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister for approval. So here's just a slide just showing your kind of cycle. So again, as I mentioned, the spring, summer is when you really start identifying your priorities. There are two kind of specific times or periods where the process might differ, and that's in an election year. So, if we stick to the fixed date elections of October, you're looking at a speech from the throne, the government actually getting constituted later in the fall, usually late October, early November. And then you're looking at a speech from the throne in early December. The parliament usually sits for maybe a week or two in December, and then you're off to your holidays already. And so the budget process in an election year will happen under very condensed timelines in December over the Christmas holidays or the holiday season. And then, of course, the budget's tabled in the spring. Normally, this is your kind of cycle. So you start planning in the spring, identify some of the priorities. You know what programs are expiring the following year. And then you've got your work or your 2-pagers being drafted over the summer months. And then the fall is when you kind of finesse or refine your proposals. You brief your senior management, you brief your minister's office, you get their blessings, you seek their signatures, etc., and so on. And then finally, the budget is tabled in anywhere between, let's say, February to April, and in which you get your decisions communicated. The second specific budget process I'm going to say is the final year of the government. So as you know, the budget for 2025, I'll go there, will likely not get implemented fully. So oftentimes when you're drawing down your funding, you've got your 3 estimate cycles. Sometimes it's just 2 per year. There have been years where you haven't had a sub C, but your subs A and subs B. So subs A in June, subs B in December. More often than not, your funding is being drawn down through subs B, which gives you the time between the spring and the fall to get your policy design, program design, and whatnot. But when the program is urgently in need, particularly sunsetters, where the funding expires on March 31st, those things typically go through a streamlined process and will go through a subs A process. So between your tabling of the budget and June, you're rushing to get all your ducks in order. So maybe just ending on this note of crafting a great budget proposal. So obviously you're looking to include information that's relevant to the funding decision. So proposals should answer the questions of why we're proposing to do this, what we expect the impact to be, and what would happen if we didn't fund this. And proposal writers should consider that they'll be evaluated alongside many other worthwhile initiatives being brought forward by other ministers. So it's not sufficient to state that a funded proposal will lead to some benefits. Rather, you need to be specific about the value of the funding it would bring. In terms of the tone and content, proposals should be straightforward and factual. You're not doing a sell job. You're not writing a stump speech. You're just explaining the benefits and impacts, and also being upfront with the risks and downsides. There's a lot of guidance that comes with the call out. We send those out every year. They do get tweaked by finance now and then. So encourage you all to read it carefully and ensure all the instructions are being followed, working through the necessary annexes and organizing content in the correct sections. Bien évidemment, mon groupe étant le groupe de stratégie politique, on a aussi la responsabilité sur l'analyse comparative sur les textes plus. On a aussi la responsabilité sur les résultats. Et finalement, oh my God, je connais même pas le mot en français, the strategic environmental assessments, which are now the strategic environmental and economic assessments. So encourage you, if you haven't heard of that, just Google it. took effect April 1st, but the preceding policy or cabinet directive was strategic environmental assessments. Encourage you again to consult with us as well as our CMS colleagues, so Adam's team, on the funding and the costing of the proposal. And last but not least, I've got 4 more points to note, and then we'll move to Q&A. So proposals should be as short as possible, but not shorter than needed. Be very ruthless in the drafting, in concision and avoiding repetitions throughout different sections. Think through your content on expected results and keep the following in mind. So speak to the counterfactual impact of a proposal. What will be different between the hypothetical world in which the proposal is funded versus the world in which it isn't. Don't expect decision makers reading your proposal to trust you. Support all of your claims of impact with logic and evidence. And that is something finance will very much push you on. As a general principle, but particularly in the current fiscal climate, be sure to include thoughtful consideration of lower cost options. And the most important piece of advice that'll improve the quality of your proposals to start early, consult with ISED to validate your proposals. So my team, Adam's team, and others as needed. Engage horizontally with colleagues in SIPs and CMS to validate early rough drafts of your work, and brief your senior management regularly to ensure alignment with departments and federal government priorities. Sur ce, je vais cesser la parole, puis I guess we'll just move to Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Adam. It was very concise slides. I like that. Lots of information. I guess while people submit their questions into the chat or raise their hands to ask them on camera, my first question will be related to our previous session. Last week, we talked about memorandums to cabinet. So how would, in memorandum to cabinet, they have a costing section. So how would your budget submission content differ from your memorandum to cabinet costing annex?
So MCs, whether funded or unfunded, will not give you the financial authority to actually spend the money. So there are 2 kinds of MCs, right? Ones that kind of are tied to your budget that can come before or after. And then there's unfunded MCs in which you're essentially signaling to the government that you will be seeking either an off-cycle decision or funding through the budget cycle. So that's really it. Adam, you might have a better answer to that one. But generally speaking, your MC, if it's preceding the budget, you're going to be trying to make an assessment of what's going to be in the budget, because oftentimes it could differ. And then if it's following, of course, you're sticking to what the budget decision is. And then if it's an unfunded MC, again, you're going through the MC proposing the funding that you might need, and then going through the budget cycle, and then the decision will maybe change a little bit of what the MC said. But your finance or your budget document is actually the ultimate kind of decision on what funding the department is receiving. Adam, go for it if you have any.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Maybe I can add to that. It's almost like if you think about sort of the sequencing, typically, there's always different atypical events that happens, but your budget submission, your MC, and your Treasury Board submission, through that cycle, you seek to further refine the proposal or the design of what it is you're trying to do. So in terms of how the costing differs, it should, as you work through that process, become more and more locked down, for lack of better terms. So the degree of detail and certainty that you would have at the TB stage is a little bit different than at the budget 2-pager stage. And then maybe just one last comment on kind of costing, because we can have a whole session on that. On costing, the CFO is asked to verify that he or she has reviewed all of the budget proposals and the costings for the budget proposals. Whereas with the MC and the Treasury Board submission, there's actually a CFO attestation, which is it's a formal thing where essentially the CFO is putting their professional designation on the line every single time they sign off to say that the costing is true, it's fair, it's reasonable, it's all those things. Or if there are risks associated with it, those risks have been identified. And then maybe kind of one last thing, in practice, what typically happens is we do end up doing a little bit of reverse engineering of the costs because, ministers are ambitious. They will ask for hundreds of millions of dollars. And then when the Minister of Finance looks at sort of the whole thing, she will make a determination based on a number of factors. Well, maybe it's not 100 million, maybe it's $50 million that, I'm going to give Minister X for activity Y. And so you do have to do a little bit of reverse engineering after the fact.
Right, excellent. Okay, so thank you very much. That was a comprehensive answer from both of you. We have lots of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go through them one by one in order that they came in. First question is for both of you. How does a minority government, when you don't know when an election is going to be called, affect a submission timeline?
Good question. A fairly straightforward answer, I'll say. So it doesn't necessarily impact the submission timelines. And this is for one reason, and it's that there are very few confidence votes in the House. So there are specific times and moments in which a government may fall, budget being one of them, the fall economic statement being another. And then there's some that the opposition parties might put to a vote and make it a confidence vote. So I would say that the timelines are the timelines. They generally are all the same. There's a lot of politicking happening in the background in terms of deciding when a budget needs to be tabled. I'm sure you've all noticed that the budget has been tabled quite late of late. And that's because most likely there's a lot of consultation happening and horse trading happening between the political parties. And of course, in our particular case these days, you've got the supply and confidence agreement with the NDP as well, which gives you some sense of continuity, I suppose. Although even that could end at any point. But generally speaking, I don't think it would impact your submission deadlines. The only time where submission deadlines would really differ is in an election year where you have a much more condensed timeline to do so.
Adam, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's a great answer by Michael.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Next question is, in terms of implementing decisions in the budget, which should we refer to? What's said in the budget or the RD?
Another good one. So generally speaking, I'll say the RD because that is meant to give you much more detail than what's in the budget, and it's supposed to be consistent with the budget. Although I will say there are times when the department has to go back to PCO and finance to clarify certain things. I'm leading a file right now where that is exactly the case, where the budget will specifically note something, and that's most likely or more often than not because the political level has decided they wanted to communicate something in a very specific way, whereas the record of decision might want to be granting a bit more flexibility to the department. But that is something where you have to, like, the RD is technically speaking what you're being held accountable for, but it needs to be aligned with what's in the budget. So that's kind of a vague answer for you, but hopefully clear enough. If it differs substantially, then your go-to is to speak with PCO and finance and make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of the interpretation.
But maybe to add to that, your RD is your authoritative decision. And maybe I was thinking about it as Michael was going through his presentation. The RD, and this is people don't kind of click to this often, but it's kind of the case. The RD is a cabinet decision. So we think about the budget process as a process led by the Minister of Finance, and the PM is involved, but it is ultimately a decision of cabinet, except
Prime Minister. It's not a cabinet decision. It's the Prime Minister's decision.
Is it?
It is. It doesn't go through cabinet, but budget goes from the Minister of Finance to
Okay.
the Minister, and then it's Prime Minister's decision.
Okay, my mistake then.
Good. Building on that, would either of you care to discuss how this current government, so what you mentioned in your presentation, Michael, different governments operate differently with regards to the budget, how this current government is maybe different than a previous government, or how they operate maybe uniquely in the grand scheme of things?
I don't want to. Well, yeah. I mean, I will try to be very high level in my response to this. I think it differs in when decisions go to cabinet. So the MC, that'll go either for policy authority either before or after. That's a big difference. I would not say that it's very consistent in either government. There have been cases where under a conservative government, you had your MC go forward before generally speaking, the fall preceding the budget, the tailing of budget. But you also have that happening now as well. But I think more often than not, under this government, it's been after, or they've used the budget to confer policy authority. But that said, I do remember that under a conservative government, you'd also get your policy authority through the budget as well. So I don't think there's much difference. I think ultimately, it's how PCO kind of challenges and how PCO supports the Prime Minister's office, and the broader government decision-making process. So I would say largely it's consistent across the board. But it's more about the timing of when things go forward and not. I will say, for example, in 2020, when I was at Treasury Board, you'll all remember that there was no budget in 2020. Was it 2020 or 2021? I think it was 2020. There was no budget, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. And that actually resulted in a lot of off-cycle decisions, and understandably so, because there were a lot of initiatives and a lot of services that were being implemented and designed to support Canadians throughout the year. So that was a very stressful time, I think, for a lot of people in government, because you had a churn of just decisions being made on a monthly basis, and it did result in a bit less of an organized, streamlined process that allowed everyone to understand what was going on, and so much less priority setting. But of course, you had specific cabinet committees organized to kind of deal with that and make sure there was some coherence happening across the board.
Excellent. So next question for both of you. Any advice for horizontal budget submissions?
So you're always going to have a lead minister. So first, I think that it'd be great to identify who the lead minister is and who's putting it in the submission, who's putting in the actual proposal to the Minister of Finance. I think the more important element here is that there is that coordination with the lead department, and making sure that it's referred to in your letter as whether you're supporting another proposal, or whether you're supporting another minister, and just conveying that support. In terms of the actual submission package, then you just need to make sure that you're working with the lead department to make sure that your input is included there, your costing is validated, and that your attestations are shared with them as well. So I think it's much like working with a colleague within your own department, where you have to make sure that the engagement's happening, and that it's senior management's communicating clearly, and that the letters are reflecting the leads versus who's supporting. I don't think there's much more to it, to be honest. Yeah.
Adam, do you have anything to add on horizontal budget submissions?
Yeah, my best fearless advice would be for folks to talk through some of the implementation details, like the who's ultimately going to do what, right? And how you want to organize yourselves that way to deliver, because that then kind of tracks back to the budget proposal and ultimately the letter. Because as Michael said, like there's going to be a lead minister. We have a few initiatives where we have secretariats that are kind of jointly managed, but there's always kind of that understanding that one department is taking a more of a lead than the other. So working out some of those details, because ultimately when you get to the Treasury Board submission stage, you'll have to articulate how that's going to work. So having some of those conversations up front, I think, help kind of sort out those potentially crunchy bits.
Crunchy bits. Okay. And next question, can either of you or both of you speak to the optionalities aspect? What should be taken into consideration as you develop different budget options?
Sure. There was a question before it. I don't know if you wanted me to quickly touch on the, whether it's an MC or budget submission first.
Oh, yes, please.
And so that question was from Murata. So I don't know if there's a clear decision point on what comes first, budget or MC. I think if it's something you're putting together that you've been aware of, like let's say the speech on the throne commits to implementing a specific, or I'll go with a mandate letter commitment, commits you to establish a fund by a specific date, then you have that level of awareness to kind of work towards a budget submission. And so the MC might presumably come before the budget submission. There are other instances where you've got, I'll take housing, for example, which is a, very topical thing right now, where the budget might actually require a department or a minister to implement something that they didn't even ask for, in which case the MC would follow. So those are very obvious situations where an MC would follow a budget. And then, of course, the budget could be providing you that policy authority without needing an MC. So that would be in a case that, you might already have policy authority previously. It might be something that the prime minister is writing directly to the minister to do. So there's no kind of rhyme or reason. It's more of an art than a science. I think that expression kind of is very pertinent to the budget process. And then on the optionality aspect and what should be taken into consideration, I think you need to kind of have a good read of the current fiscal, well, the fiscal context, the current environment politically, and then your mindset should always be finance is looking to reduce cost. So you should always be looking at ways to reduce the cost and deliver as much as you can with that reduced cost. I think maybe I'll turn to Adam on this one in terms of the optionality of and what should be taken into consideration, but largely cost based.
Yeah, cost based. I think there's another layer to that around, is the public service best place to deliver on the thing, right? We often leverage outside organizations to help advance the public policy objectives of the government. And so sometimes there is sort of that organization or a group of organizations that have the network, the expertise, and the experience right out of the gate that would take a long, long time for the public service to build up. And if we're thinking about, well, is this something that is going to trend more temporarily than more permanent, then that starts to create the conditions or some of the considerations around, what model are you going to use? And that will sort of impact or influence your optionality.
Next question, bit of a long one. When parameters are provided for a budget proposal that results in a department not being able to get everything they asked for example, ongoing funding, direction to minimize FTEs, is it advisable to make it clear in the budget proposal that it is first installment and that subsequent budget asks will be forthcoming in following years?
So no, no is my short answer. I think when you're putting forward a budget proposal, you always want to kind of be very clear as to, like, if, as the question suggests, it's a phased approach. You'll want to be clear in terms of your funding profile across the various years that you're seeking funding for. And I would say very clearly, never ever create a cliff. That decision will probably get taken by the political parties, and I'm sure if some of you are working very closely with budget 2024, you'll see that a lot of the sunsetting programs, for example, got renewed for 2 years. So that's 1 year under this government, and the next year, for whatever government wins the next elections. But more often than not, you're not going to be proposing a budget proposal knowing that you're going to be seeking further funding without actually stating that in your budget proposal. I think that answers that question.
Adam, do you have anything to add to that?
No, nothing to add on that one.
Okay. Next question is, are the annexes generally the same for MC's budget submissions and TB submissions?
Yeah, generally they're the same. I mean, your GBA plus questionnaire is going to be your internal questionnaire to your department. But of course, there is an annex that's provided for by finance that will need to be completed. The strategic environmental assessments or the SEEA that is now in effect, that's something I think that's kept with the department and not necessarily as part of the budget package. And then the results annex, I believe, is something that's included in the budget proposal as well, and your funding table. So, while the templates might differ a little bit, it's generally the same kind of policy tools that you're applying. the budget documents.
Moving on, Adam, how much guidance does a minister or minnow receive in advance from Department of Finance in terms of likelihood of a budget proposal being picked up? Are they advised ahead of time that they should ensure budget proposals should not exceed a certain dollar figure, minimize ongoing hiring, etc.?
So I don't think they get advance notice from finance in terms of a likelihood of a budget proposal being picked up. However, the budget call out, the official call out letter from the Minister of Finance will articulate very clearly what their considerations will be over at finance and presumably the Prime Minister as well. So in previous years, particularly I'd say 2022 and 2023, there were very clear lines of direction in terms of how many priority proposals you're going to be putting forward. So they had actually capped the proposals to 5 per minister. And then in cases where ministers had, a large portfolio, there was still 5. So, at ISED, we have 11 federal organizations. And so we had a lot of prioritization happening across those 11 federal organizations to make sure that only 5 got there. Of course, departments will always try bundling proposals together, which I think people think doesn't really, or people tend to assume that finance doesn't see through that, but I'd say they do. Anyway, all to say that the letter will articulate clearly whether there are any parameters that need to be considered. So whether it's costing, whether it's number of proposals being put forward. And then in the previous year, I think there was also a specific direction on spending reduction. So you'll all recall in budget 2023, there was an announcement on spending reductions. And so, asking for an update on that and considering that through as you're putting forward your budget proposals for the next iteration of budget.
Adam, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's great.
Okay. Next question. Budget announcements sometimes look a lot different than budget submissions. What are the mechanics behind the scenes that result in this?
So I'll quickly go through the process again, but and maybe I'll do this one in French because I realize I haven't been doing enough French. Alors, quand la soumission va être soumise au ministre des Finances, le ministère va faire son triage. Et eux autres, ils vont faire le défi. Ensuite, ils vont fournir leurs recommandations au ministre des Finances, qui par la suite va aussi approuver ou pas approuver ou suggérer des changements. Suite à ça, ça va être soumis au bureau du premier ministre qui va effectivement prendre la décision. Ce qui se passe derrière les rideaux, disons, on ne sait pas exactement. So, ADMs and deputies might have an inclination as to whether or not something's being changed. Oftentimes, you can read into it by the questions you're getting from finance. So finance will sometimes challenge you and ask you specific questions. But there are times when a decision is taken politically, even at the Prime Minister's office, which you're not aware of. And there are times when, the budget's including something that the department didn't even ask for. But you would have also gotten an inclination if, for example, you get a request from finance for information on a specific topic or issue. And so then that topic is most likely going to be resulting in a budget announcement. But yeah, again, once each minister has submitted their budget proposals, as finance conducts its consultations as well with Canadians in the winter months, and that would also kind of feed into the budget process and feed into the prioritization and perhaps the design of certain announcements.
Excellent. Adam, anything to add to that?
No.
Okay, next question. Budget proposals include a detailed section on the possible consequences of not funding the proposal. For example, an inability to deliver on an important new commitment. How important is this section as part of the decision-making process?
And then to what extent is the decision not to fund the proposal?
That's the one. That's the one. It's a long one.
To accept these possible. So, I think it is important, of course, that again boils down to a decision that's got to be made by the government of the day, right? So you'll note, in your respective departments, mandate letter commitments, there are a significant number of mandate letter commitments. I think if memory serves 760. And a lot of them relate to things that have to go through the budget process or have to go through the cabinet process. So at a certain point, I think the government's making a decision whether or not they want to either fund it through a specific budget, if they want to either pick a specific year they want this to be done in. And quite often, priorities change, and sometimes they'll let go of specific mandate letter commitments because of shifting, evolving contexts and priorities. So I think it's important for public servants to clearly articulate, what the ramifications or risks are, and how you'd mitigate them. But if ultimately a government decides not to, then they're the ones being held accountable to their own commitments, right? And we all see that there are a lot of commitments that get left behind as we progress through a mandate.
Adam, do you have anything to add about things getting left behind?
No, nothing to add. I'll just reinforce they're very much political decisions, and it's left to the politicians to determine what consequences they can live with politically.
Building off that, let's start with Adam. Is it true that a budget submission may not even ask for money?
Of course. You could actually, I was reading that question thinking of a good recent example. You could have a budget submission requesting to develop legislation to do something. And I've seen it to go as far just to start tying it into the MC, and there's a whole other session I'm sure on legislation as well. Typically, like if you're going to proceed with legislation, you have to go to cabinet and seek cabinet authority for the drafting instructions. I've seen several examples recently where the budget not only provides the authority to proceed with the legislation, but also approves the drafting instructions for the legislation. So you're in essence skipping a step and going straight to developing the legislation, going through sort of that part of the process. So that would be an example where we're not seeking money. I will put an asterisk on that, because as I put my costing hat on, and in an era of cost containment, there could be resource implications, right? If we're legislating or regulating something that requires us as public servants to do something new, more than just kind of going through the legislative or regulatory process, there are resource implications. We are taking on more than what we've been resourced to do. And this is where CFOs start to get interested.
Yeah, and I would say just on legislation, to note like the difference, this is for legislation to be included in the Budget Implementation Act. So just to flag that. So, and it is a very quick process, right? So oftentimes if you have a piece of legislation that needs to happen quickly, people will tend to resort to the Budget Implementation Act because, and you've all heard the omnibus kind of terminology in previous years. So, budget, generally speaking, has to get passed before Parliament rises for the summer. So that's a very quick way of getting legislation passed and receive royal assent.
Interesting.
But it has to have a tie. I have to say, like, oftentimes you have to have a tie into budget. I think we need to be mindful of that, but certainly there have been pieces that don't have any ties.
And I suppose this leads into the next question, that if a budget is a PM decision, is it the finance minister that makes all of the recommendations on the budget submissions and then leaves it up to the PM to decide? Perhaps this could end up in a difficult conversation if the PM wants something and the finance minister says the government can't afford it.
Yeah, ultimately it's a PM decision. I mean, of course, the Minister of Finance is the one that gets to table the budget and announce that. And certainly there's a lot of conversations that happen that we're all not privy to. So then, I mean, I don't think I can really speculate much more than that on what happens behind those, behind the curtain. But I don't know if there's any more to add to that one, Adam.
Maybe just read Bill Morneau's book.
Yeah, I was thinking that in my head.
Okay, so are there situations where submissions are approved and later canceled because its implementation is infeasible?
Yes, yeah. So there are plenty. So budget will announce something. You'll have a funding decision. There are instances where you have an RD, you have your authority, you have your funding, but you're actually not able to implement in a year or in any given year. And so the funding could be booked, as they would say in the fiscal framework, but not actually drawn down. And then there are cases where, for example, you might actually have drawn down funding but are not able to actually launch a program, in which case you're reprofiling the funding from one year. There are cases where things could be accelerated, where you're taking funding from the outer years, bringing it up front. So that's all the reprofiling, but there's also decisions that, don't get implemented and sit in the fiscal framework. So the money could be booked for years and years. And there are plenty of examples of that I won't get into, but yeah, that does happen.
Adam, anything to
add? Maybe just to supplement, in order to capture those things that weren't implemented or funding that wasn't drawn down, between sort of the Department of Finance and the expenditure management sector of TBS, they go through an annual process where they'll actually reach out to departments on things that haven't been drawn down and ask the question, like, what is your intent? What's your plan? Because there are, like, I've seen years where even ISED had sort of 4, 5, 6 things sitting in the fiscal framework that we hadn't done yet. And so there's sort of that engagement to, if you don't have any plans, it's called authorities not briefed. It's really, really technical, but if you don't have any plans, then we'll unlock the funds and make it available for other things. It's just kind of that process to make sure we don't end up in situations where 20 years go by and there's like 15,000 things that are provisioned for in the fiscal framework that were never kind of done.
And sort of related to that, more a back to basics question, how does that relate to reprofiling and pay at year end? Are those related?
They're two very different things.
Could you go through those?
Sure. I'll start with the payable at year end, because I think that's kind of the simpler of the two. It's exactly what it says, payable at year end. So, often we will do things in the public service, whether it's, through contracting or otherwise, where we have expenses that are incurred in the month of March, but the invoices, for example, wouldn't come in until, and they can't come in, like can't reasonably come in until April. So what you do is you actually take the money that you think will be required to pay that bill and kind of park it. And it allows you to actually pay for that invoice in April or May or June, whenever it comes in, using last year's money. Because we have this, because of the way parliamentary appropriations work, you can't spend last year's money this year, plus or minus, without getting into kind of really complicated stuff. And so the PAYE allows us to pay our bills before sort of in the new year and before we start to kind of close out our books. So that's kind of the PAYE, and there's all sorts of reasons to do it. And folks would work with their corporate finance shop to do that, and there's internal processes and blah, blah, blah. The reprofile is something very, very different. Again, it's exactly what you think. It's reprofiling funds. And it could be into future years, but it could be taking future money and bringing it back. And so there's a whole process to do that. Typically, there's a cycle to it. There's a call out from finance to do various sort of reprofiles. There is also the off-cycle reprofile, and we get into kind of the technical nuances similar to budget. And there are templates. Of course, there are templates that go through a process where we sort of internally articulate, okay, well, we either didn't spend that money last year and we'd like to bring it forward to spend it this year. So you would kind of document the rationale for it, do kind of the costing and funding tables, and that would go to TBS, who would kind of review and vet, and they provide a recommendation to finance, who will do their own kind of review and due diligence and provide advice to the Minister of Finance, who has the final authority over reprofiles. Maybe kind of a big kind of asterisk on reprofiles of late, given the fiscal context, the Minister of Finance has not been approving nearly as many reprofiles as she has in the past. So it is kind of a big consideration for all of us as we think about, we're back to the budget proposal. Is your kind of is your proposal reasonable and realistic? Is your costing and your profile, does it make sense? Given, are you standing up something new or are you supplementing something that exists? Because that will impact your ability to spend and when you can spend. And we'll talk about sort of implementation timelines next week and how we tend to underestimate how much time it takes to sort of secure your authorities, stand something up, do the announcement. If you're looking at G's and C's, receive applications, sign contribution agreements, and get money out the door. It's actually a long period of time. And so that has an impact on your funding profile.
Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that was pretty exhaustive.
Okay, building off that, Adam, if the government isn't approving as much, couldn't that cause a problem where projects are launched without them being fully ready because of the need to get them done by fiscal year end?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even outside of sort of the current fiscal context, we've seen, I'm trying to be as neutral as possible here. We've seen instances where there is a political desire to announce and launch something without sort of the recognition of the lift required to actually sort of build the thing or implement the thing. So that does happen. And it's sort of back to being a public servant 101, fearless advice, loyal implementation. So we provide our advice around timelines, implementation, and at the end of the day, the minister who is duly authorized will tell us, well, I don't agree and I want you to do it faster. So we will do it faster. But that does, that can create challenges. That means we may have to make compromises in the implementation.
Michael, anything to add?
Well, good.
Okay, another very back to basics question. Maybe we should have started with something like this. As an analyst creating a budget submission, where do you get these numbers from? How do you predict what is accurate? Like how do you go about doing that?
I will refer back to my expression of art versus science. It very much is that. Listen, when there are obviously the costing experts in your own department will kind of be very useful in that regard. For example, when you're looking at FTEs, you have a specific percentage that tends to change over the years. I think back in my day it was 21. It's gone up to 27 for the EBP employee benefits. Adam, is it 27 still?
I think so, yeah.
So that there are certain things that you know for sure, like what to calculate. And of course, when you're calculating FTEs, I think that is also art, not science. Because we're not looking at just like bums and seats, as people would say. We're looking at FTEs, and that you might need just half a person for a specific task. So again, no real kind of formula in terms of deciding how many people you need, and then again, for the program itself, you're trying to make your best efforts in estimating or guesstimating how much money is needed to develop or implement a specific initiative. So I think sometimes it'll be dictated to you. I think in the mandate letter commitment or in commitments that are publicly made or electoral platforms, there might be some commitment in terms of funding amount. But otherwise, it's really just you working up the proposal and estimating all the different costs associated with it. And that's where the costing folks will be very, very instrumental.
Adam, anything to add?
Maybe I can put Michael on the spot. It seems to me that there's
I know what's coming.
No, so I'm trying to drill down on this question about sort of my proposal that I'm working on. As different parts of the department work on a number of proposals, those start to get rolled up and there's conversations with the minister's office and ultimately the minister. And so part of that kind of art is the calculus around what's the big number that I'm going to put in as the minister that I'm going to put in front of my finance minister, my colleague, right? And so I don't know if you can describe a little bit some of that horse trading.
Well, I have a great answer for you, Adam, because I think we're all on the same page. I'll go back to my best advice, which is start early and brief early, because that is exactly what happens at the end. I'll call it the 11th hour is, the minister's office or the minister will see the numbers and they'll be like, you want $4 billion to do what? No, you get 2 billion, make it work, and you're reverse engineering everything. So I think the emphasis is really on making sure you start early, making sure you brief early, and that your department senior management is really briefing in a timely manner, because that we all know this is going to happen. And so I mean, that's, I think, what I would say to that. There will be times when, and depending on your departmental culture, where budget processes can be very last minute. And depending on the department itself as well, you might be dealing with a department that has, I mean, again, I'm at ISED, it's an economic department, and you've got a lot of different factors playing into the decisions that are being made. So sometimes you can't necessarily escape the last minute nature of the budget planning, but yeah, that's just something you need to be ready for. And I think arguably having those alternative options, like scalable options, might also be helpful in that regard, to have an idea of where the trade-offs could be in your own proposal. But yeah, definitely, politically, I think they like round numbers, and smaller numbers if possible. But I really couldn't speculate any more than that. I think you just start early and make sure that you're getting a decision from the minister and the minister's office early to be
And
able
where
to.
does the concept of sunsetting fit in? Is that like a good political thing that's like easy to sell, or is that just like good policy making?
So sunsetters are programs that are B-based, right? So they're time limited programs that have been implemented. Some of them have lasted decades, and others have been done for very specific purposes. So I think when you have a sunsetted program, you really have to make the case of what the outcomes and the results have been to date of that specific program, whether it's worth keeping or not, and whether there are other programs that are duplicating a bit of what that program is doing. And then not oftentimes, I think sometimes a department might make the case to actually render that program permanent, and getting A-based funding for it. I think in this current fiscal context, that's less so a possibility, perhaps, but there are cases to be made where a program is really delivering results for Canadians, is helpful. Lobbyists are loving it. You got business groups kind of advocating for it to be permanent. So yeah, there are various kind of scenarios where a sunset program might be rendered permanent, whether it's just renewed for a specific amount of time, or whether they just let go of it. I think under this current context, again, a lot of sunsetter programs will probably be let go of. I know then employees that work in B-based programming tend to be aware of those kind of constraints as well.
We got one final question, and then our time is up. Striking the balance between getting your point across and not getting into any technical aspects too can be difficult. Any advice?
Get others to read it. I think if you're too in the weeds, it's always useful to have a second pair of eyes. I think your strategic policy shop like mine and at ISED will perform that challenge function. So we've got a lot of layers of approvals and review built into the system that kind of will put into question specific statements in a proposal and give advice. But at a high level, I'd say, again, conciseness is key, and trying to really explain it to someone as if they're in fifth grade. I think that's a general rule in government as well. Like you're explaining something to a fifth grader.
Adam, anything to add?
Nothing to add.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming in and speaking to us today. Really great insights and everything. The slides will be shared. The video recording will be shared with all you participants in the audience. Thanks so much for coming, and we'll see Adam next week to talk about Treasury Board submissions. So that'll be very exciting.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Nick.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Adam. Bye-bye.